One of the things that I really love about the gospel text for today is that it's a classic Mark text in that it's very dense. There is a lot happening. And one of the other aspects about Mark that I love is Mark is very real. He's very tangible. And Jesus is at his most human in the Gospel of Mark relative to some of the other Gospels. We get a very human sense of Jesus who needs to recharge, right? And I'd like to kind of go through this text a little bit backwards, perhaps. We'll start at the end. As we were just talking about in the children's time, this idea of rest, or perhaps maybe we would even use the word retreat. The idea of getting away. Jesus had been mobbed and he went away. And there's a few things that are interesting about this. One, that even Jesus felt the need to get away. Even Jesus felt the need to create some space, to turn in prayer towards God, to perhaps recharge in a way. But there's another piece to this segment of the reading today that I think is worth calling out. Simon and the other disciples hunted for Jesus. So, hunted means to search for, but in the Gospels, the word hunted is not a positive connotation. The sense is that Jesus is missing, but for maybe not honest purposes, or that Simon is not being honest in why he is searching for Jesus. Perhaps there's a sense that Simon is liking the attention that they are getting when they are around Jesus. And do you notice how Jesus responds to being found? Let's go somewhere else, because there's work to be done over there as well. It's not written in the text, but you must sense that angst that Simon has. Simon Peter wondering if they can go back and make an even bigger name for themselves with bigger crowds. And we know in reading the Gospels that comes after a fashion. But this is the very first glimpse that we get of even the disciples themselves not fully embracing and understanding the ministry of Jesus Christ. A ministry of service for the sake of others at the cost to oneself. Not a ministry towards others for the sake of enriching or causing oneself to become famous or celebrated. This sense of tension there. If we rewind the tape a little further, we hear about all of these massive crowds that are crowding around the house because they've heard what's happened and they want a piece of that. The thing I want you to think about in that part of the passage is how desperate this life is at times. In spite of our Facebook posts about how pretty our dinner looked, there's a lot that is really, really, really hard. We kind of toss it out the window with the language in the text about demons and being possessed and think an ancient people not serious about real issues. But this idea of demon possession is first century language for real ailments that in our modern times we would use different words to describe, but are nonetheless profound challenges and difficulties that beat us down in this life. I was reading an article recently about the pandemic and our response to it, worried about all of those who are in situations where they have lost their employment and yet still need to pay rent, or maybe it's been forgiven, postponed, piling up to be paid at a future date. We think of all kinds of situations that finds us in a hospital room with either a young child, an older parent, a spouse. Who knows what the situation might be? But day in and day out, we all carry things that wear us down, such that in the Gospels, when they hear that Jesus is in town, they mob him Everyone comes because everyone is hurting. Everyone hurts. The desperation in the text as people gather, there is a reminder that everyone is hurting, and hurting in a way that some of the miracles of Jesus involve giving them food because they are left their homes to find him without thought for lunch or dinner or anything else. That was then, right? Or is that in fact, in many ways, life as we know it? The challenges of this life. The text begins, as we rewind a little further, with one of the first healing miracles that we see in the Gospel of Mark. If we put together the casting out of demons and healing as being similar actions there. Jesus has been preaching in the synagogue, as we heard last week, and he's coming to Simon's house. And when he arrives, he understands that Simon Peter's mother-in-law has a fever. Now, for the church historians among you, Simon Peter has a mother-in-law. Kind of an interesting piece of trivia for the first pope. But we read this text and think, wow, how out of date is this story, right? This poor woman is sick with a fever in bed. Jesus grabs her hand and lifts her up so that she can make them dinner. It feels quaint in an outdated, awkward sort of way. But I think there is an important element to this story that gets missed when we dismiss it entirely with our modern sensibilities. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus is healing somebody, this isn't simply setting a bone, bringing a fever down. That's not the ultimate goal of healing. The ultimate goal of healing is to return someone to their place in the home, in their community, so that they might continue then to serve as God created them to serve. That they might return to their various vocations and be engaged in bringing life to the community around them. It's not just a set bone or a fever that diminishes, but returning to service. Which then we ask ourselves, well, what prevents us from serving? What are the things, maybe we would use the word, that oppress in a way that make serving difficult or impossible? In the example that we have in the text for the day, it's a fever. But maybe there are other words for fever. Cancer, injury, stroke, pandemic. There are all kinds of ailments in our lives, disabilities and challenges that we have that oppress and suppress our ability to serve. And actions that we take and that the community take to alleviate those issues. Free those people for service. And God's reign is the richer for it. God's reign is deprived of the skills and gifts of those individuals when suppressed physically, emotionally, mentally. But let's think about all of those things that suppress one's ability to serve. I was reminded this morning of that classic story in American history of Ruby Bridges. Now, growing up in the 70s and early 80s, we had color photographs. And so in my mind, if it was a black and white photograph, it's like from the 1800s. And it turns out she's like not even barely 15 years older than me. But this is the young black girl with pigtails braided as she is walking down the steps of an elementary school in Louisiana in 1960, surrounded by 4 white federal marshals as the schools were being integrated. that was and is real oppression and suppression. She was the first of many whose gifts might have the opportunity to flourish in a wider environment, that God's reign might be blessed by a broader and more colorful vision of those gifts freed for service. But we don't have to go back all that far. Just in the time that I have been serving at Grace, in fact, 10 years ago, we think of the service at St. Mark's in San Francisco, where LGBT sisters and brothers who were refused the opportunity to serve as pastors in the ELCA were celebrated for the gifts that they brought to the church and continue to bring. This, too, is oppression and suppression, and God's reign and the service that God's creatures, all of us, can bring all of creation is diminished by that. We think of racism. We think of oppression against the LGBT community. We think of illness. We think even in the Gospels ultimately of death as that force that seeks to oppress and separate us from serving in God's reign. In the story today of Jesus healing Simon's mother-in-law reminds us that at a basic level, our ministry is about freeing from oppression, whatever that might be, so that we might be freed to serve. So as you think about this text, as you go through this week, there's a number of things to keep track of. Take time for rest. Take time to retreat. Take time to turn towards God. Take time to listen to God, that you might understand how you are being called to serve those in your family and community, that you might free those who are being oppressed by any number of things, that they might be freed to serve as fully as you are. I think as we leave in the service, at the very end, we always say, "Go in peace, serve the Lord." And that work continues even in these days. Amen.